guys. Thanks for coming back to our APES virtual classroom. The end is in sight. My name is Ms. Fassler, and I teach APES at Marshfield High School in Marshfield, Wisconsin. So we're going over the rubric to the second exam, and then we have a celebration day tomorrow. Dr. Sowell and I will both be here. And in addition to just celebrating and telling you how amazing you are, we have some kind of tips and tricks for the FRQs to help you get set in the next week and a half before our exam. So the first question that we looked at yesterday was the experimental design question. This is the one where you get a little bit longer time. And although we're going to get into the experimental design aspect of the question in a minute, this first part, which is super common on both of the questions you're going to have, is focusing on visual representations. Dr. Sowell, when he went over the first exam yesterday, and we've stressed this throughout the reviews, that when I look at this science practice, the skills are scaffold, and it gets a little bit more complex or elaborate what I'm asked to do. So the first one, we're kind of living up here in this: just describe an environmental concept, process, or model represented visually. So I'm going to describe the relationship between island size and species richness. And there's a couple of different ways that I could express that. I could say, well, let's take a look at it. Remember the I-squared technique we've learned? This is my independent variable, the area of the island, and the number of species, or the species richness, is dependent on the area. And I can see that this is a direct relationship. There's a couple different ways I could express that would all be accurate. I could say that if I increase the size, I increase the species richness. Or the opposite of that, if I decrease the size, I decrease the richness. Or I could simply describe the trend line that expresses that relationship, that there is a direct relationship. As one variable goes up, the other goes up as well. Next, we're moving down into the a little bit more complex part or scaffold of that practice, where I'm going to do some explaining, and I'm going to explain the cause of that relationship. In other words, why is it that when I increase the size, I increase the species richness? And again, there's a couple of different explanations that I could have provided. One idea is that the greater the size of the island, the larger the habitat. I can support a greater number of different species. The greater the size or area of the island or habitat, it tends to be more diverse habitat. I might have some area that is woodland and some area that is open field, maybe some area that is coastal. So I could support a greater variety of species. And the next two things here are, if I were taking notes about the idea of ecology and biodiversity, and I'm going to have like kind of one note sheet that summarizes those big ideas. One of the things we'll go over tomorrow. I like this idea about being able to talk about complex niche structure and complex food webs. Remember that I could say that, well, if there's more area and there's more species, I can have each of those different species is really honed in and has a complex niche structure, and that allows them to avoid competition. Next, we wrapped back around and looked at that just like AI asks me to describe this other relationship, and that's the relationship between distance from the mainland and the species richness or number of species. And the idea here, in the pure sense of island biogeography that Wilson and MacArthur figured out, was that the mainland serves as the source material for immigration to these islands. And so this island out here that's pretty far away, it would be more difficult for organisms to travel as great a distance to immigrate there versus if they only had to travel a shorter distance to immigrate and increase the species on that island. So this is a reverse relationship. As I increase the distance from the mainland, the furthest out island has the lowest number of species. And the description of that is simply the opposite of what we did in I. Increasing the distance decreases richness, or there is an inverse relationship. Next, we went on to describe two benefits, ecological benefits that greater biodiversity provides. So my task verb here is to describe, provide relevant characteristics. I think the terms describe and explain confuse students. So we'll look at both today and in tomorrow in our review celebration. But when I explain something, I'm explaining why something happens, or a process explaining how something happens. Describing is to provide characteristics. So if you were going to describe your high school to me, you might say, oh, my high school is urban or rural, or there's 1,000 students in my high school or 5,000 students in my high school, or my high school is known for particular athletic or academic or extracurricular programs. So when I think about describing the benefits of biodiversity, I wanted ecological benefits. I think it's some things like my students will go, well, I get it. Like I get that biodiversity is really important and there's a lot of benefits, but I don't really know how to describe the characteristics of that. And this is really something that you want to summarize on your review sheet as well. That when I look at the benefits of biodiversity, if I have a lot of biodiversity, I'm probably filling a lot of those different ecosystem services. And keep in mind the big idea of what we're talking about with biodiversity and ecology in general, and this idea that all these different species and populations are interacting and depending on one another. So when I try to take a step back and think about the question before I just start puking out a bunch of information, it really becomes a little more evident to me. I could talk about genetic diversity. Remember, we have ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. So on a previous FRQ rubric, they use this term, more source material for evolution. And my students would look at that and go, I don't know what that's talking about. Well, what it means is source material means gene pool. If I have a large number of individuals in my population, each of them that brings their own unique genetic diversity. So the greater the number of individuals, the greater the diversity of genetic information or traits, so that when some unknown environmental change happens in the future, they have that source material. They already have that gene in the population that is going to allow them to adapt to a changing environment. And then a lot of these get into the benefits of biodiversity are that I'm more able to fulfill a lot of those ecosystem services, such as pollination, pest control, filtering air or water, the amazing ability of soil microbes and their importance in biogeochemical cycles, the ability to regulate or moderate climate. All of these are services, ecological benefits of having a lot of biodiversity. And then we went into kind of a long passage about how this original theory of island biogeography is being applied today, currently, by conservation biologists. And in this case, it's conservation biologists working in the Rocky Mountain region with the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. And they're looking at the impact of habitat fragmentation. They're specifically looking at the Canada lynx. And unfortunately, you're not going to have a hard copy in front of you, and all those skills that us APES teachers have been talking about all year long, like underlining and circling keywords, you're not necessarily going to be able to do looking at the question on a screen. But please trust me that the 25 minutes or 15 minutes that you get to answer these questions is enough time for you to really stop and read and process. And literally in 30 seconds, what I'm underlining here, I could be jotting down as notes on the side of my paper, because they're giving me a lot of information about the Canada lynx. It's a specialist predator. It reproduces only once a year, has a pretty small litter, somewhat variable. We talked about this in one of the review videos, how some populations can kind of adjust their litter size based on resource availability. So that's kind of variable, but they stay with their mother. They don't leave that den until the next breeding season. So almost that whole first year, basically after they're born, they're living in the den with mother, and mother's first nursing them and then teaching them how to hunt and protect themselves. And then researchers are interested in designing an experiment to determine the 1-year rate of survival of the kittens, of the offspring in an unprotected area. And so let's take a look at the scientific practice of scientific experimentation. And again, that's scaffolding. Just realize that there's not any, you're never going to, when you design an experiment, obviously you're not collecting any data. This is what we did in our lab while we were in the classroom, but you should be able to respond. And I will talk about all of the other parts of this practice, A, B, C, and E. So the first was just identify a research question or hypothesis. And so my hypothesis would be that a disturbed or unprotected area would have a lower survivorship of kittens, or a protected, undisturbed area would have more kittens survive that first year. Next, we're getting into the research method, design, and measure used. You've seen this question asked a lot. We don't know if they're going to ask it on our exam on the 18th, but there's a chance that they would. Identify the control. So I always remember to have a control that is not being subjected to that independent variable. And if the question that I'm asking is about unprotected or disturbed areas, I want to compare survivorship of kittens in a protected area as well to see if there's a difference. My independent variable is the number of kittens that survive. That is dependent on if they live in a protected or unprotected area. And then other aspects of a research, design, or measure used. And I included a couple of examples here that we can talk about. The idea of replicates. In other words, if I went to a protected area and looked at the number of kittens in one den, and an unprotected area and looked at the number of kittens that survived in one den, it's just not really, I don't have any data to average. So we kind of like to see probably a minimum of 3 different replicates. In other words, at each site, I'm going to look and track kitten survivorship at 3 different dens to make sure I'm looking at a representative survivorship value in disturbed versus undisturbed. I maybe want to put in something in my research design about the time parameters. In other words, I'm going to let this experiment run for an entire year because that was the goal. I want to know how many of them are able to survive to 1 year. And that's important because that's when they're old enough to start reproducing. The type of data I'm going to collect. Again, I'm not collecting the data, but I could say I'm going to count the number of kittens at birth, and then maybe I'm going to say how the data was collected. I'm going to use some type of tracking system. Maybe I'm going to put radio collars on them or tag them in some way so that I can track, here's the kittens that were born. I'm going to be there in early spring when they're born, and then I'm going to track them throughout that year and calculate, make a tally of and calculate how many of them actually survive. So remember that my research design or method wants to talk, it's like if you're going to write that lab report and you're going to lay it out, where are my different test groups? I've got my dependent and my independent group. I always want to be testing or have a replicate that and a number of different sites to average. And then I can talk about the type of data that I would collect or how I would collect it. Now we're kind of switching gears a little bit and going into the idea of K strategist and R strategist. And this should have been a pretty easy question. This is kind of that low-hanging fruit that when the test writers write a question, they always have a few points that they're like, okay, any kid that sat through an APES course should be able to get this point. And then here's a few points that, boy, a kid really had to go through and review their material and watch all those review videos, and they're going to get a few more points. And then we have that student that really is able to demonstrate and communicate a really deep understanding and application of the information. They're going to get a couple of the more difficult points. You don't have to get all of those difficult points to get a passing score on the AP exam. Now, we got passing scores of a 3, a 4, or a 5 benchmark. There's always some points that all kids should be able to get, and that's kind of this identify point. Identify 2 characteristics. Remember, this task verb identify simply means I need to state a characteristic. I'm not going on and elaborating or describing or making any sense of it. And these are the 4 that I picked out of that passage. They have a small litter size. They provide parental care. They have a late age to reach maturity. They have to wait that whole first year. They're not right away going out and reproducing. And they tend to be a specialist feeder versus a generalist. Remember that with R&K strategist, we tend to be able to classify animals into one, or plants into one strategy or another, K selected or R selected, but some animals may have characteristics of both. I don't think they'd probably give us a confusing situation like that on an exam. Next, describe 2 threats that a species faces when its population becomes very small. So let's take a step back and think about this. So that, in other words, if I'm a wildlife biologist and I see that the number of kittens that are surviving keeps shrinking and shrinking, and my population's getting smaller, what are some threats? What is going to be a challenge to that population if its numbers become very small? And I think one of the most obvious is, well, they might have a hard time finding a mate, or there could be a disparity in the sex ratio. Maybe if there's only a small number of kittens surviving, randomly there's more males than females, and they're not all going to have mates then. Another pretty obvious one is that the smaller the size, there may be competition from other species with a similar niche. And a lot of times in animal populations might kind of work together as a group to either fight off predators or get their own prey or food. And so there tends to be more competition with animals that have a similar niche. This is the one that I think a lot of my students probably went with, that one we just talked about, that genetic bottleneck, that idea that when a population becomes very small and they have a smaller gene pool and smaller genetic diversity, they're going to lose the ability to have those beneficial traits, or a harmful characteristic or trait may become more predominant within the population. Oh, this is the one I just talked about, that idea of susceptibility of reduced fitness. I don't think anybody used that exact verbiage, but it's just a good way of communicating the idea. So maybe put that in words that make a little bit more sense to you, and then increased vulnerability to a specific environmental disturbance, for example, a forest fire or something like that. Describe one realistic solution that could be implemented to minimize the impact of habitat fragmentation. Even though we're really focusing on the experimental design and not quite the solution part, obviously they're putting some of that in here as well. And the key part here is realistic. So we could make a habitat corridor or some type of bridge or structure that would connect the area of intact habitat to those little habitat fragments or habitat islands. I could put land into a conservation trust. I could get private landowners in that unprotected area to agree to keep their private land in a conservation trust and maintain that habitat. I could try to educate those private landowners about the value of keeping their land, their habitat intact, so that those animals have room to move. And I could use a legislative solution. I could encourage protection of the land through the Endangered Species Act, because if an animal is listed as endangered, we, just by the nature of that act, by the criteria, also protect its habitat. So that was question number 1. Hopefully that went pretty well for you. And again, if you didn't quite finish all the prompts, don't get too stressed about that. It makes a little more sense to have good, pointable responses rather than making sure you just put something down for everything, even if it wasn't a very good description or explanation. So the next question, really great question as well. This is our solution question, where we're looking at what's happening in urban areas as population grows and moves into these areas. we have geologic features and climatic factors that make some locations more prone to pollution. So right away, I'm thinking, okay, geographic factors, geography, that's like things like where's there a river, where's there a mountain, where's there a valley, different features of the land. And then climatic factors, is it hot? Is it warm? Is it sunny? Is it an area that has a lot of precipitation? And we want to look at how human activities then are impacting ground level ozone and smog formation. So before I even start reading the question, the prompts to this, I just want to take a minute and look at my visual representation. Not a lot going on here. It's pretty simple to interpret, and just think about all of that valuable information they provided me in the stem of the question. Oh, here's those geologic features. Okay, I'm on an ocean, coastal area. There's mountains over here. It's a big urban area. I got a cold ocean here. So I got a cold ocean breeze coming in there. And I've got to try to bring all of that back around to, oh, that's right. When I have that situation, that thermal inversion, and I remember it doesn't cause the photochemical smog to form, but it traps all that down there. So now I'm super excited because I took just a couple of minutes to really make sense of that question and process it a little bit before I jump right into the questions, because now the questions are going to make a little bit more sense to me. So first of all, I have to describe how a thermal inversion would form. And there's probably a couple of key points that I want to use in that description of listing those characteristics. So one characteristic to describe how this forms is I've got that cold ocean breeze that's coming in, and that cold air mass is going to sit, it's going to be dense, and it's going to remain near the surface. And the warm, less dense air mass is going to trap that cold air. So I went into kind of an extensive description, but you should have been able to get that idea across. They told me it was a thermal inversion. So they didn't say like, what is this process? That's pretty picky and like a little fact. They want me to be able to explain and describe the process, not just name it. So cold air mass comes in from the ocean. That cold air mass is dense and it isn't able to rise. Describe the relationship between thermal inversion and pollution. So again, I'm listing the characteristics. How do I make a connection between a thermal inversion and pollution? Well, remember, when that thermal inversion forms, the concentration of pollutants near the surface increases. I have to say that. That's what I do when I describe a relationship. I can't just say there's a relationship between a thermal inversion and air pollution. To describe that relationship, I would have to say when there is a thermal inversion, there is more air pollution or less air pollution trapped down in that lower layer. And as a result, that all those pollutants, that high concentration near the surface. Next, we're going into the part where we're asked about factors that relate to the climate. Explain one factor of climate that could make the city in the diagram susceptible to prolonged periods of ozone and smog. And that's that the climate factor is the fact that it is, one climate factor could be that that city is located in a very warm environment with a lot of sunny days. It didn't have to show me that. It said explain how one factor related to climate could make it more susceptible to ground level ozone and smog. So remember that the sunlight is an essential ingredient in the formation of photochemical smog. You could also have talked about heat. I'm thinking that's a climate factor that makes sense because all chemical reactions, like that chemical reaction that makes the photochemical smog, happen faster at warm temperatures. Sometimes those things go hand in hand. I think the key climate factor is that idea of sunlight. It's got to be a sunny area. Areas, even big urban areas that just don't have a lot of sun, where it's overcast a lot of the time, just don't have those problems with photochemical smog. Explain how a geographic feature could make the city in the diagram more susceptible to prolonged smog. And that's the mountains that we looked at. So the geographic feature would be the location that it sits in a valley surrounded by mountains. This is because those pollutants are trapped in the valley. Wind currents that come through are blocked by those mountains. The tall buildings could serve the same function, but that's not an appropriate answer for a geographic feature. And that's why we really, right from when we read the prompt to begin with, the stem of that question, we really focused in on what they told me. It made the rest of the question just flow a lot more easily. Next, we're going to go to explain how the average annual precipitation compares on the east and west side of the mountains. And the key word there is compare. If I simply say one side of the mountains has a lot of rain, period, I'm not going to have expressed that comparison. So again, reading carefully is so important. Now I have to get the answer right. The west, they tell me what here, this is north. So the west side of the mountains would have a higher annual precipitation. The eastern side of the mountains would have a lower annual precipitation. And because I have to explain how, put because in. Always prompt yourself when you see explain how to give a relationship and then explain why that is. The reason for that is because the moist air mass coming in from the ocean has to rise over the mountains, and as it cools, it has a lower water holding capacity. Therefore, all the precipitation is going to fall on the west side of the mountain. The eastern side of the mountains is going to have less precipitation. I have to make sure I mention the other side of the mountain to get that comparison. Now we're into our environmental solutions. Air pollution isn't the only problem that we're experiencing here. Man-made structures in urban areas can increase the amount of runoff reaching streams and lakes. Describe how a common man-made structure found in urban areas contributes to urban runoff reaching lakes and streams. And again, I'm describing how something happens. So it's going to take a couple of processes, steps in the process in order to communicate exactly how that happens. So a common man-made structure would be paving, parking lots, cement. The man-made structure is impervious. You don't need to have that word impervious in your vocabulary, but you need something that communicates that idea because it's a really big idea. That idea that there are some surfaces that water can infiltrate, like natural surfaces like soil or a forest or an agricultural field, anything where there's a natural substrate that'll allow that water to permeate. When I put in an urban area, that man-made structure, all those parking lots, cement, any impervious surface that doesn't allow water to infiltrate. When it rains, that water is going to infiltrate and recharge groundwater, or it's going to run off. The water is still there. It's just the way it's going through the hydrologic cycle. And that's really what this point is asking. This is coming back to the content of the hydrologic cycle. When it rains, that water can either run off or infiltrate for the most part. And the problem with it running off is I'm changing the rate at which it's moving through the water cycle. I'm not recharging groundwater. I could have flooding of local streams and rivers. And it's not a situation that is a natural process for that water. And looking at our visual representation, we hit the last part of that scaffold. And then we started to describe an environmental problem. Lastly, then, we're going to propose a solution to that environmental problem. And I could look at putting vegetation along my parking lots, or I could have some type of terracing to capture that water as it runs off. I could have some type of retention pond or wetland, or you could just like a pond, a big area to capture or collect all that water and let it slowly infiltrate before it reaches surface water like a lake or a stream. Other things I could do could be to, in an urban area, to put something like a rain barrel or a cistern to capture that water. It's not ever even reaching the pavement then, and I've captured it and I could use that water then for watering plants or something like that. And finally, our last point, and this I think is kind of a confusing point to students, it's justifying a proposed solution by explaining potential advantages. And so an additional advantage of planting trees would be that, oh, they serve as great wildlife habitat. All that vegetation that I planted to capture that runoff is now going to serve as food or habitat for native wildlife. They provide green spaces, maybe for aesthetic value. Maybe I've created parks or recreation areas, and they provide shade and improve air quality as well. Those rain barrels that I put in, or cisterns to collect my water, could reduce the amount of rain or the amount of water that I took from my hose or my tap to water plants. And if I restore or maintain wetlands, I'm providing protection from storm surge and filtering of that water. So lots of good connections there to provide another benefit that allows me to justify that solution. So we kind of worked through describing a solution, describing the benefits of that solution, and justify it by explaining other potential advantages. So hopefully you did well on that question also. Just to remind you of a lot of important links here. I'm going to kind of go through another step slide here in just a second. Please make sure you do the exam demo. I know Dr. Sowell talked about that as well. We went over that yesterday. Make sure you know how you're going to submit and that you understand the timing, because the minute that timer goes red, you should start wrapping up because you can't miss the submission time. That's really important. And finally, these 5 steps. Try the exam demo, complete that checklist. The list is in that previous link. Really important to confirm your email. You should get your e-ticket 2 days before the exam. So they've left plenty of a window there that if you have any kind of problem, you have time to solve that before the actual exam day, because you can't, once that time starts in your time zone on Monday the 18th, it's too late to figure any of this out. And then you should check in 30 minutes early. That's really important as well. During that 30 minutes, you can be organizing your notes. Make sure you have a nice, hopefully quiet environment that you can test in. Try to ask other family members to maybe not be online if your bandwidth is an issue, so that's not a problem for you. It's not a big lift, you guys. It's just simple little things that we want you to think about just to check off those boxes and make sure that you're ready to go. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been fabulous, and we will be sure to see you tomorrow for our celebration. Have a great rest of your day.